He only wanted a quiet hike, a few hours alone beneath the trees. But when his boots struck uneven soil beneath a silent oak, he uncovered something buried, something wrapped in cloth, marked with warnings, and humming with a power the forest itself seemed to recognize. Shadows watched on the ridge as he faced a choice: walk away, or carry with him what was never meant to be found. At sunset, the box was gone from the earth. What he took may never let him go. Would you have opened it, or left it buried forever? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning had not yet fully arrived when he parked his car at the edge of the gravel lot and slung his pack over his shoulders. The world was still caught in that in-between state, where the air felt damp and cool and the faintest suggestion of light painted the eastern horizon in shades of pale blue and ash. He drew a long breath, tightening the straps until the canvas pressed snugly against his back, then adjusted the brim of his hat. For a moment, he simply stood there listening. No voices, no engines, no signs of the world he had left behind. Only the quiet expanse of the woods stretching ahead, the faint outline of the trailhead sign, weathered by years of rain and sun. His first step onto the dirt was louder than he expected, the sole of his boot grinding against small stones, scattering with a sound that seemed almost intrusive. The silence of the forest amplified everything. The shifting of his pack against his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his breath, even the beating of his heart. The trail cut forward like a vein into the body of the woods, narrowing and disappearing beneath the canopy, where the trees leaned inward, their branches tangled into a dark arch. He paused long enough to take in the sight before committing to it, then set off with a steady pace that he knew he could hold for hours. The path itself felt alive underfoot. Leaves, damp from night mist, clung to the earth in layers that softened each step, though here and there patches of exposed roots forced him to watch his footing. The smell of wet bark lingered in the cool air, mixed with the faint mineral sharpness of stone. Each breath filled his lungs with the taste of earth, raw and unfiltered. A squirrel darted across the trail ahead, vanishing into the underbrush with a flick of its tail, the only movement he had seen so far. He thought about the map folded in his back pocket, a simple set of lines tracing ridges and streams. Yet in the half-light of dawn it seemed useless. The forest cared little for paper directions. Here, the trail marked itself by wear and memory, by the grooves carved from years of boots and weather, each bend holding the suggestion of something older than any hiker who passed through. His pace slowed as the incline sharpened, breath quickening, the sound carrying strangely in the cool morning. When the first shaft of sunlight pierced the treetops, it painted the ground in streaks of gold, lighting the mist that hung low in the hollows. He stopped to watch it, struck by the quiet beauty, but also by the faint unease that rose in him unbidden. The woods were still, too still, as if holding back their voice until they'd gone further in. He listened again, waiting for the chatter of birds that usually greeted the day, but none came. Only the crunch of his boots and the faint creak of leather straps answered him. He pressed on, deeper with each step, following a trail that narrowed and curved until the world behind him felt sealed away. The air grew cooler, the light thinner, the silence thicker. He knew the day was just beginning, but already the forest had taken him in, and in that stillness the sense of being watched, by roots, by trees, by something older, settled against him like a second weight. He adjusted his pack again and kept walking, knowing without quite knowing why that something waited for him further down the path. The trail bent sharply after a shallow rise, and for the first time since dawn broke, he slowed not from weariness, but because something ahead drew his eyes. The trees along the path had been ordinary until now. Slender maples and pines, their branches alive with the soft quiver of morning light. But what stood before him was different, an oak rising larger and heavier than any of its neighbors. Its trunk seemed older than the forest itself, its bark thick and furrowed, its crown stretching high and wide. And yet it carried no life. Not a single bird clung to its branches, no squirrel darted across its limbs, no whisper of wings cut the air above. The silence that had accompanied his hike thickened here, pressing it around the tree as though sound itself had been pushed away. He stopped in the middle of the path, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, and stared at it. Something about the oak unsettled him. The other trees welcomed the morning, leaves trembling as the breeze stirred them. But this one seemed immune, its branches rigid against the sky. The leaves that clung to it were dull, a darker shade than those around, as if the season had advanced more quickly here. He found himself scanning the branches, waiting for movement, a flutter of feathers, the familiar dart of a bird leaving its perch. Nothing came. The longer he stood, the more certain he became that nothing would. Stepping closer, he noticed the ground beneath it did not match the rest of the forest floor. The soil was uneven, mounded in places, as though disturbed not by animals scratching for food, but by human hands. Roots jutted awkwardly out of the earth, curling upward instead of sinking deep, exposing twisted veins of wood that looked as though they had been pried loose. His boot nudged against a patch where the earth seemed freshly shifted, and the soil crumbled easily, looser than compacted ground he had walked over for miles. He crouched, resting the pack against one knee, and ran his hand across the dirt. It was cooler here, damp in a way that didn't match the rest of the trail. Tiny pebbles clung to his fingers, but what caught his attention were the faint ridges, like the impressions of something buried and pressed against the surface from below. He leaned closer, brushing aside leaves and pine needles, revealing patches of ground that looked almost geometric, straight lines where none should be. The air seemed heavier near the tree, the kind of weight that settled not on the skin but deeper, pressing against the chest. He listened again, straining for sound. Still nothing. Even the wind that had whispered to the canopy a moment before seemed to have stilled here, as if the oak had drawn the air into itself. His eyes drifted back up the trunk. Faint scars lined the bark, grooves that might have been old carvings softened by time. He couldn't make out shapes or letters, only the impression that someone had once marked this tree deliberately. A shiver ran along his arms despite the weight of his pack and the exertion of the hike. He had walked through forests countless times, slept under pines, crossed ridges and valleys without fear, but this felt different. The oak seemed to watch him, though it had no eyes, seemed to hold something beneath it that demanded notice. He shifted his weight, considering whether to move on, to treat the unease as nothing more than imagination. Yet his boots did not carry him forward. Instead, he found himself kneeling again, brushing more soil aside, unable to shake the sense that the ground here hid something meant to be forgotten. The forest was vast, but at that moment it felt narrowed to this single tree, to the silence beneath its branches and the disturbed earth at its base. He set his hand flat against the soil, feeling the faint coolness seep into his palm, and wondered what lay just below the surface. The trail still waited ahead, but his gut told him the story of the woods began here. He shifted his pack from his shoulders and let it rest against the roots, the straps damp from morning mist. The ground before him seemed ordinary at first glance, just another patch of forest floor scattered with leaves, twigs, and the pale remains of acorns. But the longer he stared, the more wrong it looked. The soil didn't hold the same compact firmness he had felt along the trail. Here, it looked softer, darker, as though the earth had been turned and pressed back into place. It carried the uneven texture of something worked by hands, not the slow rhythm of seasons. He crouched lower, running his fingers over the dirt. It broke apart too easily, sliding between his fingertips with none of the stubborn density of untouched ground. He brushed aside the top layer, and beneath the scattered leaves he saw faint ridges, almost like seams, as though a shape beneath had pressed upward just enough to leave its mark. A few roots of the oak twisted in strange directions, curling back toward the surface rather than burrowing deeper. They seemed to frame the disturbed soil, like the crooked bars of a cage bent outward. He sat back on his heels, breath moving slower now, listening again to the silence that had not lifted since he first noticed the tree. It was as though the forest held itself in check, waiting for him to decide. Every instinct told him to stand, to shoulder his pack and move on, let the oak and its uneasy soil remain undisturbed. But something else worked against that caution. A pull deeper in his chest, a weight that whispered this place would not release him until he knew what lay beneath. Carefully, he swept more leaves aside, using the edge of a stick to clear away debris. The soil crumbled in small clumps, soft, like it had been loosened not long ago. He pressed his palm into it, feeling how it gave under pressure, how it sank more than it should. A patch no larger than a small table revealed itself, rectangular in outline. The edges were faint but present, unnatural in their straightness. His pulse quickened as his eyes traced the shape, and a thin line of sweat worked down his neck despite the cool air. The roots tangled around the edges seemed almost deliberate. Thick strands twisted upward, their bark rough and split, locking into soil like guardians of whatever lay below. He ran his hand along one, following the curl until it disappeared back into the ground, and he realized with sharp breath that they grew tighter around the rectangle, as though time itself had conspired to seal it in. Yet the looseness of the earth told a different story. Someone had fought those roots, pried them back, disturbed the soil, then tried to cover their work again. He leaned closer, his face nearly level with the ground. The smell rose stronger here, earth rich and damp, cut with a metallic tang of iron. It filled his nose, heavy, insistent. His fingers dug deeper now, not just brushing leaves, but scooping handfuls of dirt away, small mounds forming at his knees. Each movement seemed louder than it should be, his breathing rough, the scrape of his hand against a root sharp in the air. He paused once, glancing over his shoulder at the trail, half expecting to see someone watching. But the path was empty, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Returning his focus to the patch, he pressed harder, uncovering more of the surface below. The outline grew clearer, corners too precise for nature, edges running straighter than any stone or root should. He sat back again, chest rising and falling faster now. There was something buried here, something placed deliberately, then hidden under the weight of the oak and the silence of the forest. His gut tightened as he reached again for the soil, pushing past the last of his hesitation. He had walked into these woods for solitude, for distance from the noise of the world, but he knew now he had stepped into something else entirely. Whatever had been buried beneath this tree had been meant to remain unseen, and yet here he was, hands deep in the dirt, uncovering what someone before him had tried to hide. The forest waited around him, silent and patient, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. His fingernails were lined with soil by the time he cleared the first corner. At first, it was only the faintest resistance, something hard under the loosened dirt that his knuckles brushed against. He pulled back quickly, uncertain if it was a stone, but the sound it made as his nails scraped across it was different, hollow, metallic, carrying a resonance that stone never had. He pressed his fingers in again, scooping away handfuls of earth until the shape revealed itself more clearly. There, caught in the shallow light breaking through the canopy, a dull glimmer of rust appeared. His pulse jumped at the sight. The glint was not bright but muted, the kind that comes from iron left too long against damp soil, its surface corroded and flaking. He froze for a moment, crouched low with his breast shallow, staring at it as though it might vanish if he blinked. He reached out again, brushing the back of his hand against the edge, feeling the texture decay, pitted uneven, yet undeniably worked by human hands. The more he dug, the clearer the shape became. The metal curved into a corner, then extended outward, forming a line that disappeared beneath more earth. It was no fragment or buried scrap. This was deliberate, contained, something that had been built and placed here with intention. He widened the hole with careful strokes, scraping dirt away with the edge of a stick, moving slowly so as not to damage what lay below. The roots resisted him, curling close against the surface, their twisted lines gripping the corners as though unwilling to release their hold. Sweat gathered along his temples, even in the cool air, not from exertion, but from the weight of realization. His heart hammered against his ribs in a rhythm that seemed to echo louder than his own movements. A box. He could see it now, the corner emerging fully, the outline of iron edging visible beneath the thinning soil. His hand lingered against it, measuring its size. Not small, not simply a container for tools or forgotten trinkets. It was heavy, purposeful. Whoever had buried it had gone to great effort to conceal it beneath the roots of this oak. The silence around him deepened as he uncovered more of it, and he became aware of how the forest seemed to hold its breath. Every scrape of soil away from the corroded surface sounded louder than it should. Every small rock that slid free clattered against the iron with sharpness that made him flinch. He paused once, leaning back on his heels, and looked again at the canopy. Still no birds. The branches above remained empty, unmoving, as though even the smallest creatures had abandoned the oak and whatever protected. Driven by something he couldn't name, he pressed forward, clearing more of the top surface until the full edge of the box emerged. The rust clung thick in some places, flaking away in others to reveal the dark iron beneath. He traced it with his fingertips, following the line of the corner to the next side. The shape was rectangular, solid, its surface rough with age but intact. He could almost hear the echo of tools striking it decades, maybe longer, before he had ever set foot on this trail. The soil piled higher around his knees as he worked, his breath quick and shallow, the ground beneath him damp from the digging. When his fingers finally slipped along the top edge and met the faint outline of a hinge, his stomach tightened. This wasn't just a container. It was meant to be opened, secured against time and weather, hidden until someone chose to uncover it. He sat back again, resting his palms on his thighs, staring at the rusted edge that now gleamed faintly against the morning light. His gut turned in knots, the instinct that pulled him toward the oak now demanding he follow through. He knew nothing about what was inside. It could be worthless, it could be dangerous, it could be something that was never meant to be found. But the box was here, under his hands, and the forest silence left him no room to walk away. He pressed both palms flat against the exposed metal, feeling its chill seep into his skin. His pulse raced faster, almost wild, as though the box itself carried a heartbeat of its own, waiting for him to break the seal. The soil gave way reluctantly as he pried the rest of the box free. Each scoop of dirt revealed more of its surface until it sat there, half emerged from the earth like some relic the forest had tried to claim and failed. He shifted back on his heels, staring at it in disbelief. The object did not belong here. The rust clinging to its surface gave the impression of age, but its edges were too clean, its form too deliberate to be mistaken for debris. It was rectangular, thick-walled, the kind of construction meant to endure. He brushed his hand across the top, flakes of corrosion breaking loose under his touch. The hinges resisted even the smallest pressure, their iron swollen and crusted by time. He pressed hard with his thumb and felt them hold firm, fused shut as though the box had not been opened for decades, maybe longer. The weight of it was evident even without lifting. Its mass pressed into the soil, roots curling tightly around its corners as though the tree itself had grown to keep it trapped. Leaning back, he tried to picture how it had come to rest here. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, wild and unbroken. No signs of logging camps, cabins, or settlements anywhere nearby. He had studied maps of the area before setting out, and none suggested human habitation in this section of woods. And yet here it was, an iron box, set deliberately beneath an oak older than memory. It carried the unmistakable look of something hidden with care, meant to be found only if someone ignored every warning that instinct whispered. The air clung to him more heavily now. He wiped his palms on his pants, but found them damp again in moments, sweat rising in spite of the cool morning. He had walked into the woods expecting quiet, maybe solitude, maybe a small adventure to write about later. But this was something else, something that felt larger than his presence. The box was too real, too undeniable, and it had changed the shape of his morning entirely. He bent again, running his fingers along the seam where the lid met the body. Dirt clung to the groove, packed tight, but beneath it he could feel the faintest line. Whoever had placed it here had meant for it to remain closed. The rust and soil had done the rest. His knuckles brushed against the corroded hinges once more, and he felt a shiver crawl down his arm. They looked ready to crumble, yet when he tested them, they refused. Not the kind of weakness that breaks apart, but the kind that has sealed itself by time and pressure into something unyielding. For several minutes he sat motionless, his pack at his side, staring at the object as though waiting for it to explain itself. The forest around him gave nothing away. No bird called. No wind stirred the branches. Even the light seemed muted here, caught above the canopy as if unwilling to touch the ground. The box sat in the center of it all, silent and immovable, the single note in a silence too vast. He leaned forward once more, placing both hands on its surface. The chill of the metal seeped into his palms, colder than it had any right to be after lying beneath soil. He felt its weight press back against him, not just physical, but something deeper, like the heaviness of an unopened door that might change everything on the other side. His gut twisted, urging him not to walk away. Whatever this was, it had been waiting. It didn't match the decay of the roots and soil around it, didn't belong to the natural slow ruin of the forest. It had been placed here, deliberately with purpose. And now, for reasons he could not name, it was as to open. He sat with his knees drawn up, staring at the box as though it might shift on its own if he waited long enough. The iron was rough under his fingertips, cold despite the thin wash of sunlight that managed to slip through the canopy. He let his hand rest there, feeling the stubborn resistance of rust, the weight of time pressed into every seam. Part of him wanted to stand, brush the dirt from his hands, shoulder his pack, and continue down the trail. He could pretend he had never seen the glint beneath the soil, never felt the strange gravity that pulled him closer. The forest was wide, and the world beyond it wider still. It would be so simple to leave the box where it had been left, to let the oak roots cradle it for another generation. But the longer he looked, the more impossible that thought became. There was something about the way the ground seemed disturbed only recently, the soil too loose, the roots too forcibly bent aside, that gnawed at him. Someone had been here before him. Someone had uncovered this box, maybe even tried to open it, and then covered it again. The realization made his throat tighten. If another set of hands had touched it, why had they left it behind? And why did his own chest ache with the certainty that he could not walk away? The air around him felt different now, heavy with an energy he couldn't name. The forest had fallen so silent that he began to notice the small sounds of his own body, the faint rush of blood in his ears, the creak of his joints as he shifted on the ground, the rasp of his breath drawn in and out too quickly. It was as if the woods themselves were holding still, suspended in some expectant pause. He glanced up into the branches, searching again for birds that never came. The leaves moved only slightly, stirred not by wind but by their own weight, as if they too were waiting. He ran through arguments in his head. He told himself he was just a traveler, that he had no right to pry into secrets that had nothing to do with him. He told himself that objects buried this way often carried trouble with them, that stories began like this and ended badly. And yet, beneath those thoughts, deeper and quieter, his gut whispered another truth. He was here for a reason. He had followed this trail, had noticed the oak, had stopped when another might have kept walking. He had dug when another might have passed by. Every choice had led him here, and the box seemed to confirm it. He pressed his palms flat against the lid, leaning his weight on it. The iron did not shift, but he felt the firmness of its presence beneath him. It wasn't just an object. It was something placed with intent, left with a story sealed inside. He thought of the people who might have buried it, long gone, perhaps, or maybe still alive, bound to it in ways he couldn't imagine. The thought unsettled him, but it also sharpened his focus. If they had meant for it to remain hidden, they had failed. His gut told him it was his turn now. He leaned back, looking once more at the dark soil scattered around the edges, the mound of dirt he had created by digging. His hands were already dirty, his nails lined with earth. He had already crossed the threshold. Leaving it buried now would not erase the fact that he had seen it, touched it, uncovered its secret corner. That knowledge was part of him now, and it would haunt him on every trail, in every quiet night alone, until he returned. The forest seemed to breathe with him as he made his decision. He tightened his jaw, slid his fingers along the rusted hinges, and knew there was no turning back. Whatever weight pressed against him was not only the iron of the box, but the pull of something older, something that had waited for him. The silence of the woods was not emptiness. It was expectation, and he was not going to leave it unanswered. He sat back on his heels and reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the small folding knife he always carried on long hikes. The blade clicked open with a sound that seemed sharper than usual, slicing through the silence like a thin fracture. He studied the latch again, corroded and swollen, its edges fused by time and damp earth. The knife looked almost fragile against the iron, but it was the only tool he had. He wedged the point into the seam, testing it first, feeling the resistance push back against his hand. The latch groaned when he applied pressure. Rust powdered under the blade, falling in small flecks across his knuckles. He braced one hand against the box and leaned in harder, driving the knife deeper into the seam. The sound it made, metal grinding against metal, sent a shiver through him. It was too loud, far too loud for the still forest. Every scrape echoed outward, rebounding off trunks and branches, as if the trees themselves were carrying the noise further than it should go. Sweat pooled along his brow, not from effort, but from unease. He paused, breathing through his nose, listening again for signs of movement in the woods. Nothing. No birds, no distant animal calls, not even a faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Only the sound of his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. He forced himself to return to the work, pressing the blade harder, rocking it side to side until the hinge began to shift. Then came the snap, a sharp metallic crack that felt wrong in its intensity, like a gunshot muffled beneath layers of soil and air. He froze, knife still in his grip, eyes darting instinctively to the trees around him. The sound lingered, its echo trailing away in a way that made him certain it hadn't just belonged to the latch. It was as if the entire forest had absorbed it, carried it further, repeated it in some unnatural chorus. His breath quickened, throat dry. He looked down again at the box, where the latch now sagged at an angle, broken free from its long hold. The metal was jagged, curled in on itself where it had given way. He touched it gingerly, half expecting it to snap again beneath his fingers. The knife blade trembled slightly in his grip as he pulled it free of the seam, wiping rust from it on his pants before folding it closed. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It pressed against him from all sides, dense and suffocating, as though the sound of the latch breaking had closed something off rather than opened it. His skin prickled with the certainty that the forest had taken note of what he had done. He shifted his weight, resting both hands on the lid, and felt the faint give of hinges loosen for the first time in decades. For a long moment he hesitated. The box was no longer sealed, but it wasn't yet open. The choice still belonged to him, though each second made it harder to imagine leaving it shut. He thought again of the disturbed soil, the twisted roots, the way the ground seemed shaped to hold this secret. Someone had hidden it. Someone had wanted it bound in silence. But the latch had broken under his hand, and now the forest waited for what came next. He drew in one steady breath, pressed his fingers beneath the lid, and lifted just enough to hear the groan of iron moving against iron. The sound was long, strained, echoing outward in the same unnatural way as before. He lowered it quickly, heart hammering, the lid settling back with a dull thud. He sat still, every nerve alert, listening for the faintest shift in the woods. Nothing moved. The silence was unbroken, yet the air around him felt charged, alive, as if the trees were holding their breath alongside him. His gut clenched with both fear and anticipation. He knew he could not walk away now. The seal had been broken. Whatever waited inside had been silent for too long, and the moment demanded that he see it through. He pressed his palms flat on the lid again, his knuckles pale, his breath uneven. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting. With a slow, deliberate motion, he prepared to lift the box open fully, knowing the sound would carry further than any human step ever could. The hinges protested with a long, drawn-out groan as he finally pried the lid open. The sound dragged through the silence like a wound, and he half expected the forest itself to recoil. He braced the lid with both hands until it leaned back far enough to stay open on its own. A faint, earthy smell rose immediately, damp and metallic at once, as though the box had trapped decades of decay inside it. He leaned over, peering into the darkness within, and his breath caught. The interior was not filled with soil as he had expected. Instead, it was packed deliberately, its contents arranged layer upon layer with unsettling care. The first thing he saw was cloth, darkened and frayed with age. He reached in and pinched a corner between two fingers. The fabric disintegrated slightly under his touch, scattering threads across his knuckles, but beneath it another layer waited, folded more tightly, pressed down as though meant to cover what lay below. He pulled the cloth free and set it aside, his movements clumsy, his heart racing faster with each breath. Beneath the cloth came paper, sheets folded unevenly, their edges yellowed, their surfaces stained with dark patches of moisture. He lifted one carefully, holding it by the corners, and saw faint handwriting stretching across it, lines of script blurred and nearly lost to time. The words meant little at first glance, half of them smudged beyond recognition, but certain symbols caught his eye. Circles, arrows, intersecting lines that reminded him more of maps than of letters. He placed the sheet aside and uncovered another, then another, each one carrying similar marks, warnings perhaps, or directions, though the language was unfamiliar, almost coded. His hands trembled as he continued. The unease grew stronger the deeper he went. Whoever had buried this box had not simply tossed things inside and covered them over. They had layered them with intent, each fabric fold, each paper packet placed as though to shield or conceal the next. He lifted away more cloth, smaller squares of fabric wrapped around objects he could not yet see. The fibers were stiff with age, some of them almost brittle, breaking apart into dust as he touched them. Each piece seemed to whisper of hands long gone, of time's heavy passage, of secrets meant to remain sealed. Finally, beneath the last thin wrap of cloth, he saw it, a bundle swaddled in oilskin, its surface still faintly slicked despite the years underground. The material had done its work. Whatever lay inside was preserved, hidden from water and air. He brushed his fingers along its surface, feeling the stiff folds, the knotted twine that bound it shut. The oilskin glistened faintly in the muted light filtering through the trees, and for the first time he felt something close to dread rise sharp in his chest. This was the heart of it, the thing that had been protected, or perhaps imprisoned, beneath so many careful layers. He let his hand rest on it for a long moment, his breath uneven. He thought again of the disturbed soil, the twisted roots, the silence of the birds. None of it felt coincidental. This bundle was not meant for chance discovery. The papers and cloth had been warnings, barriers of their own kind, urging him to turn back before reaching this point. Yet he had ignored them, peeling back each layer until only this remained. The forest seemed to lean closer around him, waiting, as though the very air recognized what it uncovered. He tightened his grip on the bundle, lifting it slightly, feeling its weight shift within the folds. It was heavier than he expected, solid, with edges that pressed sharply through the oilskin. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and lowered it back into the box for a moment, afraid of what it might reveal when unwrapped. The unease deepened into something more tangible, a certainty that he was trespassing into a story larger than himself. But even as his gut knotted, another part of him, that same pull that had driven him to dig in the first place, demanded he go on. His fingertips lingered on the knot of twine, knowing that once he pulled it free, there would be no return to ignorance. The silence of the woods pressed down, patient and unyielding, as though it had been waiting all along for this moment for him. He eased the oilskin bundle aside and returned to the stack of papers, unable to ignore the strange weight they carried. They were fragile, edges curling inward, the ink smeared by moisture and time, yet enough remained to unsettle him. He unfolded one sheet carefully across his knee. At first glance it looked like a map, though crude and incomplete. Lines crossed the page in jagged strokes, some curving to form shapes that resembled hills or rivers. Small symbols marked certain spots, circles with slashes through them, triangles pointing downward, and others he did not recognize at all. His chest tightened as his eyes traced one line in particular, because it curved and bent in ways he recognized. It matched the trail he had just walked. He pulled another page from the pile, setting the first beside him. This one carried more writing, though most of the words were unreadable, smudged into dark stains that obscured letters. The parts that remained legible sent a shiver through him. Fragments of phrases like "not to be opened," "do not cross," and "marked beneath the oak." The words repeated in places, as though whoever had written them had been desperate to impress the warning, repeating themselves over and over. The third page was worse. Symbols filled nearly every inch, drawn over one another in frantic layers. Circles intersected with arrows that pointed in no clear direction, and the margins were filled with lines of writing that looked almost feverish. His eyes caught on one phrase again and again. They watched from the ridge, scrawled across the bottom, letters overlapping as though the writer had run out of space. He swallowed hard, his tongue dry, and looked instinctively toward the ridge that loomed faintly beyond the trees. Empty, silent, but somehow not reassuring. More pages followed, each carrying some variation of warning, map, or coded message. Some marked paths that twisted away from the main trail. Others showed clusters of symbols around areas deep in the woods, places he had never heard of. What unnerved him most was how often the oak appeared. It was drawn again and again, sometimes marked with an X, sometimes circled, always at the center of the map, as though it were the axis around which everything else revolved. Whoever had made these pages had considered the oak significant, dangerous, maybe even sacred, and now he was sitting beneath it, the very box they had buried resting open at his feet. He tried to imagine who had written these notes. The handwriting varied, some careful and neat, others frantic, nearly illegible. Perhaps more than one person had contributed to them. Their warnings layered across years. The thought unsettled him more than the words themselves. How many had stood here before him, crouched in the same soil, staring at the same tree, leaving behind their frantic cautions for anyone who came after? And why had they returned to bury them, rather than burn or scatter them? The forest seemed to press closer with each page he uncovered. The air had grown heavier, thicker, as though the woods themselves absorbed the words and mirrored their intent. His gut churned as he set the pages in a small pile beside him, trying to order them into some pattern, some meaning. But the more he looked, the less sense they made. Routes intersected with routes. Warnings contradicted other warnings. Symbols repeated without explanation. It was not a guide, but a labyrinth, a record confusion, and fear left by those who had passed through before. One final page lay at the bottom of the stack. It was darker than the others, the paper almost brittle, the ink faded to brown. Across its center, in large, slanted letters, one sentence stood out clearly: "Do not unwrap the final cloth." He stared at the words for a long time, his breath shallow, the oilskin bundle sitting beside the box, as though it had been listening the whole time. His fingers hovered above the page, tracing the faded lines without touching them. The warning was direct, sharper than any of the others. And yet the bundle still drew his eyes, heavier now in its silence, waiting for his decision. The papers had given him caution, a map of dread etched by unknown hands. But his gut still whispered the same insistence it had from the start. Go further. The forest around him seemed to agree, its silence no longer empty but charged, holding him at the edge of choice. The bundle sat heavy in his lap, its oilskin wrapping slick beneath his fingers, still carrying a faint sheen of preservation, despite the decades, maybe longer, it had been buried. The knot of twine was tight, stiff with age, but it came apart with enough patience, fraying into brittle strands that clung to his fingertips. He hesitated before peeling back the first fold. The warning on the last page echoed in his mind. Do not unwrap the final cloth. But the silence of the forest pressed against him, as if the words themselves were already too late. His gut urged him forward, the same instinct that had driven him to dig, to pry, to uncover. He loosened the folds one by one, each layer sticking faintly, as though reluctant to part from the thing they enclosed. When the last edge of oilskin fell away, he saw it. At first glance, it looked like a box within a box, small and self-contained, but the details emerged the longer he studied it. Its casing was wooden, dark and polished smooth in places where time should have stripped it raw. The corners were reinforced with tarnished brass, etched with faint designs that caught the weak light filtering through the canopy. Across the front sat a cluster of dials, their faces ringed with markings that bore no resemblance to numbers he knew. The symbols curved and slanted in unfamiliar directions, more like fragments of an unknown script than any language he could recognize. Two thin needles rested at the center of the largest dial, overlapping each other in perfect stillness. He reached out and touched one gently, surprised by the faint resistance it gave, not loose like a broken piece, but held as if by design. The brass felt warmer than the wood, as though it retained some energy of its own. His fingertips tingled where they brushed it, and he pulled back quickly, unsettled by the sensation. The device was intricate, delicate in its construction, but also purposeful. It was not a trinket or a toy, not something carved for beauty alone. Its weight in his lap told him it had function, though he could not begin to guess what that was. Smaller engravings lined the wooden surface, curling around the brass fittings, etched so finely that he had to tilt it toward the light to see them clearly. They were symbols again, repeated ones he had glimpsed on the papers, drawn here with precision instead of frantic scrawl. Circles intersected with sharp lines, triangles layered within one another, patterns that made his stomach twist with recognition. He turned the object slowly, careful not to let it slip. The back was fitted with a panel of brass, worn green at the edges where age had touched it. A small slot interrupted the surface, just wide enough to suggest something had once been inserted or removed. The thought unsettled him further. Whatever this was, it had been designed to connect, to interact with something else, something that was no longer present. The silence of the forest deepened as he studied it, his ears straining for the smallest break in stillness. He could hear nothing but the sound of his own breathing, quick and uneven, and the faint brush of fabric as he shifted the device in his hands. It felt wrong to hold it, yet impossible to let go. His gut told him this was the heart of everything he had uncovered, the reason the box had been buried. The thing wrapped and wrapped again as though every layer of cloth was meant to keep it hidden from hands like his. For a moment, he imagined the person who had last touched it. Had they stared at the same unfamiliar symbols, tracing them with the same unease? Had they felt the same pull in their chest, the sense that they should not, yet must continue? The thought that others had held it before him made his fingers tighten around it. He looked down at the needles again. They had not moved, but his chest ached as though they had shifted in some way too subtle for the eye. The air tasted heavier now, metallic at the back of his tongue. He set the device carefully on the cloth beside the box, yet even there it seemed to radiate its presence, filling the clearing beneath the oak. Every warning on the pages seemed clearer now, no longer abstract scribbles, but direct, desperate attempts to keep this very moment from happening. And yet he had unwrapped it. He had seen it. He had placed his hands on it. The forest did not stir, but he felt the charge in the silence like a current. The object sat before him, needles still, dials silent, symbols etched deep into its surface. It was unlike anything modern, unlike anything he had ever imagined, and it waited, patient, as though knowing he would not be able to look away for long. The device sat heavy in his palms, its brass edges cold against the skin. He turned it slightly, tilting it toward the dim light filtering through the canopy, watching the needles lie still against the etched dial. The air around him felt different now, denser somehow, as if the forest had drawn closer. He shifted his grip, and that was when he felt it, a faint tremor running through the wood beneath his knees. At first he thought it was his imagination, the fatigue of holding himself crouched for so long, but then it came again, more distinct. A hum, so low it was nearly beneath hearing, stirred the silence. It wasn't sound exactly, more vibration that lived in the soil and rose into his bones. His fingers tightened around the object, and sensation grew stronger, spreading outward in subtle waves. He froze. His breath caught shallow in his chest, as the roots of the oak beneath him seemed to carry the rhythm upward. They pulsed faintly, a hidden current weaving through the ground as though the tree itself had been waiting for the device to return to light. He pressed one palm to the soil beside the box. The earth trembled against him in a way that was unmistakable now, like a thread pulled taut beneath the surface. It was steady, not random, and too controlled to be mistaken for the shifting of water or the settling of roots. His eyes lifted toward the massive oak, its trunk furrowed and scarred, its branches still rigid against the sky. For the first time, he thought he could hear something in the silence, not birdsong, not wind, but the faintest echo of the vibration in his ears. The device warmed faintly in his hands. Not enough to burn, not enough to alarm, but enough that he could feel growing alive against his skin. The brass seemed to hum with the same resonance as the soil. He tilted it again, and the needles quivered, just barely, a movement so slight he might have doubted it if not for the sick twist in his stomach that followed. They did not move freely, like something mechanical, but as though answering to something deeper, an unseen alignment taking place between object and ground. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and held the device out slightly away from his body. The hum deepened, becoming more distinct, resonating now not only through the earth, but through the air itself. The sound was still low, barely audible, yet it pressed against his chest like a physical weight. He imagined it threading through the roots of the oak, spreading outward beneath the forest floor, carried like a signal through hidden channels. The thought unsettled him more than the sound itself. What if this was not beginning here, but awakening elsewhere, far beyond his reach? The forest remained still. No birds returned to branches. No breeze stirred the leaves. And yet he felt watched, as though the sound was not simply something he had uncovered, but a call answered. His eyes flicked toward the ridge again, remembering the words scrawled across the papers. They watched from a ridge. The trees there were dark, their shapes blurred by distance, but the weight of presence pressed against him from that direction. He forced his gaze back to the device. The needles had shifted further, crossing at an unfamiliar angle over the etched symbols. His fingers tingled where they touched the wood, numb with the vibration passing through it. He set the device down quickly on the oilskin, but the hum did not stop. It lingered in the ground, in the air in his chest. The roots seemed to thrum faintly with it, their twisted lines now resembling the veins of some hidden network carrying messages through the forest. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs, steadying himself, but the sensation refused to fade. He realized then that this was no simple relic, no forgotten artifact sealed away for curiosity's sake. It was connected to the oak, to the ground, perhaps to the very forest itself. And by touching it, by unwrapping it, he had completed something left undone. The hum persisted, not growing louder but heavier, as though it settled into the soil in permanent rhythm. He sat frozen, aware that whatever had begun beneath the roots would not stop simply because he wished it. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt awake. He lifted his gaze from the trembling ground, forcing his eyes away from the device that still seemed to breathe faint vibrations into the soil. The oak towered above him, vast and immovable, its thick trunk catching what little light filtered through the canopy. He had looked at it before from a distance, but now, with the hum still resonating in his chest, he noticed what his eyes had skimmed past earlier. The bark was not simply furrowed by age. Patterns cut into its surface, lines and grooves that were too precise, too deliberate to be the work of time alone. He rose slowly, knees stiff from crouching, and stepped closer to the trunk. The air around it was cooler, the smell of earth stronger, as if the tree exhaled differently than its neighbors. He reached out with tentative fingers and brushed them across the scars. They were old, older than him, older than the trails he had walked to get here. The bark had tried to heal over them, pushing out rough ridges to cover the marks. Yet the shapes remained clear. Circles intersected with lines, triangles carved with deliberate depth, symbols etched with a hand that had not cared for artistry, but for permanence. He leaned closer, tracing one with his fingertip. It was nearly identical to the symbols on the pages he had pulled from the box, the same intersecting forms repeated over and over. His breath caught in his throat as recognition settled in. Whoever had left those papers had also left their mark here, perhaps long before the notes were written, or perhaps long after, returning to inscribe the oak itself with warnings or rituals he could not understand. The more he looked, the more he saw. The marks spread across the trunk in uneven clusters, some higher than his head, others close to the ground where the roots split and curled outward. They weren't random scratches from animals or weather. They were deliberate inscriptions, layered across decades, maybe centuries, some faded so deeply they could barely be seen, others still sharp as though carved only years ago. His stomach twisted at the thought that different hands, across time, had stood where he was now, knife pressed the bark, adding their own mark to the story. He stepped back, craning his neck to follow the marks higher. They stretched upward beyond his reach, vanishing into the thick canopy, where the branches began to twist. In certain places, the pattern seemed to repeat, forming sequences that mirrored the layouts of the maps. His eyes darted from one cluster to another, and the connections grew undeniable. The oak was not simply a tree. It was a record, a monument, carrying the same symbols that filled the papers, the same language etched into the device. His pulse quickened as he imagined how many people had noticed him before, how many had walked this trail, without looking closely enough to see. Generations of hikers might have passed beneath these branches, unaware that they were being shadowed by marks left for those who knew how to look. And now he had uncovered the box, the pages, the device that made the ground hum. He could not convince himself it was coincidence. He pressed his palm against the trunk again, this time feeling the faint vibration there too. The hum carried upward through the wood, subtle but undeniable, threading itself into the scars as if the tree recognized the device's return. He pulled his hand back quickly, staring at his palm as though it might bear some trace of the contact. The forest was too quiet, too still, and yet it felt alive in a way that unsettled every part of him. The symbols no longer looked like warnings alone. They looked like instructions, maybe prayers, maybe locks meant to bind something within the roots. He stepped back until he nearly stumbled over the open box at his feet, his eyes still fixed on the marks climbing into the canopy. They had been there for decades, unnoticed, carved by hands that might never have left the forest again. And now, with the device humming beside him, they no longer seemed dormant. They seemed awake, just like the earth beneath him. He leaned his back against the oak, steadying himself, the vibration of the bark still faint against his spine. His eyes wandered instinctively to the ridge beyond the clearing, the line of trees silhouetted against the dim light. At first, it was nothing more than a blur of branches swaying faintly, but then he noticed a shape that did not move with the wind. He squinted, heart quickening, and another shape took form beside it. They were too tall, too rigid, to be trunks. He held his breath, watching carefully. The hum from the device still lingered in the soil, but now his attention was fixed upward. Slowly, more figures resolved themselves in the shifting light. He counted 3, then 4, then more than he could be certain of. They stood apart from one another along the ridge, spaced in unnatural symmetry, as though arranged deliberately. None moved. They only stood, their silhouettes distinct against the pale sky, watching from a distance that felt both too far to matter and far too close. A chill worked its way down his arms despite the weight of his pack and the heat of his effort. He blinked hard, half convinced his eyes were inventing them from the branches and the shadows. But when he opened them again, the figures remained. One shifted slightly, just enough for the outline to break and reform, and the certainty hit him like a blow. They were real. He wanted to believe they were hikers, travelers like himself who had stopped on the ridge to survey the forest. But something about their stillness unsettled him. No conversation drifted down, no flicker of light from a headlamp or phone. They stood with the same silence that had blanketed the forest since he uncovered the box. His mind flashed back to the pages in the box, the scrawled warning written again and again at the margins. They watched from a ridge. He had dismissed it as paranoia then, the product of some fevered hand. But now the words pressed heavy against his chest, too precise to ignore. The urge to move, to pack up everything and walk quickly down the trail, surged within him. Yet his legs did not respond. He felt pinned to the spot, trapped by their gaze. He could not see faces, only the outlines, but he felt their attention fixed on him, unwavering. The forest that had once seemed vast and empty now felt like a stage, and he had solitary figure under their silent observation. The hum deepened, or perhaps it was only his heartbeat rising to meet it. He crouched quickly, pulling the oilskin bundle closer to himself, shielding the device from their view, though he had no reason to believe they could see what he held. Still, the instinct was there, as strong as the gut pull that had made him dig in the first place. His eyes darted back to the ridge. The figures had not moved closer. They had not retreated either. They simply remained, the silence between them and him heavier than words could ever be. He whispered to himself without meaning to, a fractured thought spoken aloud just to hear his own voice. The sound startled him, sharp and foreign against the quiet, and he quickly clamped his mouth shut. The watchers did not respond. They stood, as though waiting for him to take the next step, as though what he did next determined whether they would remain still or descend into the clearing. The sun had slipped further by now, the ridge darkening into shadow. The figures blurred at the edges, but their presence did not diminish. If anything, it grew stronger, the certainty of their watch pressing into him like weight. He wanted answers, who they were, how long they had been there, why they stood so silent. But all he had were questions that circled endlessly with no hope of resolution. He realized in that whatever the box contained, whatever the tree bore witness to, it was not hidden from them. Perhaps it had never been hidden at all. Perhaps it had only been hidden from him. He crouched low again, the device resting on the cloth before him, the box yawning open at his knees. The forest pressed close on all sides, charged with silence that made his own breathing sound unnatural, too loud, like a trespass. His eyes flicked from the box to the ridge and back again, thoughts circling with no anchor. The watchers still stood in the distance, their outlines sharp against the fading sky. They had not moved, not one of them, yet he felt as though every second was measured by the weight of their gaze. He tried to steady himself, drawing slow breaths. But the question coiled tighter in his mind. What now? The box had been sealed, buried with care, wrapped in warning after warning. He had broken that seal, peeled back every layer, and placed his hands on something that thrummed with life beneath its silence. To take it with him felt reckless, but to leave it behind felt worse. If he reburied it, would the soil cover the hum? Would the trees swallow the evidence again, roots twisting around it as though nothing had been disturbed? Could he convince himself it had never happened? The thought of walking away empty-handed, of trying to sleep at night with a memory of brass needles and humming roots gnawing at him, made his stomach knot. He imagined reaching the trailhead again, stepping back into the world beyond the forest, and carrying the burden of knowing. The knowledge itself was already inside him, heavy and unshakable. Leaving the box behind would not free him from it. The choice was not whether he carried it with him. It was whether he carried it in his hands or only in his head. The watchers loomed larger in his thoughts. He glanced back to the ridge. They had not advanced, but he could not rid himself of the certainty that they were waiting for his decision. If he shouldered the pack and left with the box inside, would they follow? If he buried it again, would they step forward to finish what he could not? The pages he had read came back to him in fragments. Do not unwrap, marked beneath the oak. They watched from the ridge. Every word seemed written for this moment, as if the choice had been foreseen, laid out long before his hands touched the soil. He pressed his palms against his thighs, trembling slightly from the weight of indecision. The box sat silent now, but the silence felt deceptive, like a pause between breaths. He imagined lifting it, strapping it to his back, and carrying it through the trees. He imagined the weight dragging at his shoulders, the sound of his footsteps amplified by the hum, the certainty that the watchers would track every movement. He also imagined covering again, pressing the soil back, smoothing it over until no trace remained. But he knew the earth would not feel the same. He would always know where to look, always feel the memory of the disturbed ground pulling him back. His gut twisted with a clarity that unsettled him more than the humming or the silence. This was not a choice he could escape. Whichever path he chose, it would follow him. To carry the box would be to accept its burden openly. To leave it behind would be to carry its absence, an emptiness just as heavy. Either way, the oak and the watchers had already marked him. The forest had already claimed him in its silence. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing the brass edge of the device once more. It was warm now, faintly alive beneath his touch. His breath shook as he let his hand rest there, knowing that the weight of decision pressed down harder than the soil he had dug away. The choice was not simply about the box. It was about what kind of man he would become when he stepped back onto the trail. The light had shifted while he wrestled with the decision, the day tilting slowly toward its end. The sun slipped low, its glow breaking through branches in narrow beams that painted the forest floor with gold and shadow. The oak loomed taller in that dying light, its scarred bark catching brief glimmers before darkness claimed it again. He had not moved for what felt like hours, crouched in the soil that clung to his boots and knees, the open box yawned before him like a mouth waiting for an answer. When the moment finally came, it was not with sudden clarity, but with a weary acceptance that he could not linger forever. His fingers closed around the device, and the hum that had pulsed faintly through the ground seemed to swell in his chest. He slipped it back into the oilskin, wrapping it as carefully as he could manage, though the fabric clung stubbornly and refused to fold the way it had before. When it was tied as securely as his shaking hands allowed, he lowered it into his pack, the weight settling instantly against his spine. The box, empty now, remained half buried at the base of the oak. He brushed loose soil across it, covering the jagged hinge, but did not fill the hole completely. No amount of dirt could disguise what had been disturbed. The ground looked wrong, unsettled, the roots jutting up as though straining towards something that no longer held. He stood and brushed his hands against his thighs, the streaks of soil smearing darker against the fabric. His gut clenched as he looked down at it one last time. He had taken what the forest had guarded, and nothing he did could change that. The ridge drew his eyes once more. The figures were still there. The failing light made them harder to distinguish, but he knew they remained, their outlines waiting just beyond certainty. He could not tell if they had moved closer or if the deepening shadows simply pulled them forward. But their presence weighed on him just as heavily as the pack now strapped to his shoulders. He did not linger long. To stand in that clearing any longer felt impossible. He hoisted the pack higher, the straps biting into his shoulders with more weight than the device should have carried. Each step back toward the trail was deliberate, the soil muffled beneath his boots, the silence of the forest never breaking. He expected at every turn for the watchers to descend, for the ridge to empty itself into the trees around him. But the forest remained still, the silence pressing against his ears until even the sound of his breath seemed foreign. When the first streaks of orange burned across the horizon through gaps in the canopy, he finally turned once to look back. The oak stood dark against the glow of sunset, its branches stark and unmoving, the ground and its roots scarred by his hands. The box was no longer visible, swallowed by shadow, though he knew it had not been fully reburied. What the forest held now was absence, and absence carried its own weight. He adjusted his pack and continued forward, each step pulling him farther from the oak yet deeper into the burden he had chosen. The silence followed him down the trail, a silence that did not feel empty but alive, as though it had wrapped itself around him to travel wherever he went. He knew then that it would not leave him, whether in the echo of his dreams, in the stillness of night, or in the restless hum that would rise again when he least expected it. What he carried was no longer just in his pack. It had become part of him. By the time the last light drained from the sky, he was gone from the clearing. The oak remained, its scars etched deep, its roots unsettled, its silence complete. But the forest was not unchanged. Something had left with him, and what stayed behind was not the same as what had been buried.